Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we used Alzheimer's disease as a clinical example to try to bring together much of the information we've learned in this course. If you look at the signs and symptoms in the patients and you know something about the brain areas that are involved, you could have predicted that they would show the changes they do. And so understanding about the structure of the brain really helps us understand this disease. So let's just summarize a little bit of what we found. Alzheimer's is characterized primarily by the loss of neurons in certain areas of the brain. So while there's neuron loss throughout the brain, there are specifically a few areas that show an abnormally high loss of neurons. These include the highest order areas of the neocortex. So these are specifically the areas, the prefrontal areas, and others of the higher order areas in the neocortex. The primary areas are left intact, so the individual can see, they can hear, they can walk, but they simply can't do the higher order processing that's necessary to live in the world as a normal human being. Other areas that are involved are limbic structures. So we saw that the hippocampus was one of the main structures that was involved. The entorhinal cortex was one of the neocortical areas involved. You also saw involvement of the amygdala. And in this disorder, you see the short-term memory loss, long-term memory loss, ultimately because long-term memory is widely distributed in neocortical areas. And so if you lose these higher order areas, then eventually you lose long-term memory as well as short-term memory. The amygdala, that little nuclear complex involved in emotional processing, is lost, and it causes the person to not be able to relate emotionally in a normal way to the world as a person. And lastly, we saw that many little tiny nuclei that probably early neuroanatomists didn't even think were important at all have widespread projections to the cortex that are fundamental somehow for the integration of many different functions. And the loss of these neurons contributes to the dementia that we see in the disease. Now, for most cases of Alzheimer's, there's no cause known. Only a small percentage can be inherited. For all the cases, there's no cure. So at this point, the medications simply try to replace some of the neurotransmitters which have been lost from the loss of the neurons. In this lecture, we want to focus on what neuroscience is discovering about what factors increase or what factors decrease the risk of developing Alzheimer's. Now, even if you follow everything and you do everything the way you're supposed to, it doesn't mean that you might not get this disease. But there are risk factors which are associated, and so this is really important. This is the #1 neurological disease in the United States, and it matters that we identify factors, particularly those under our control, that might help us be able to decrease the risk of getting this terrible, terrible disease. Much of what we've learned about risk factors has come from basic research, obviously. Now, animals don't get Alzheimer's disease, but we've actually created animal models that we can use to study the disorder. And so we can do other things to these animals to see whether or not the types of changes in their brains, these tangles and plaques, develop more or less under certain conditions. And the other study that's really helped us understand something about risk factors is called the NUN study. And this is a study of Catholic sisters who show a very low incidence of Alzheimer's disease. We're going to be talking about how they have contributed to our understanding of this disease and the risk factors. So while the studies indicate that some factors are not under our control, it turns out some are. So there are factors that either increase or decrease the probability that you will in fact get Alzheimer's disease. So let's start with the ones that increase your risk for getting Alzheimer's. Well, the very most important one is age. Age is the #1 risk factor in the development of this disease. 1 in 8 people 65 or older have this disease, And if you're over 85, as many as 1/2 of individuals will be diagnosed with this disorder. So age is the #1 risk factor. Now, we want to live a long life, so obviously we don't want to do anything about that one. Well, another risk factor is the inheritance of what are called E4, E4 alleles for apolipoprotein E. Now, alleles are simply gene variants. So alleles are gene variants for a particular molecule that's produced. In this case, the alleles are for apolipoprotein E, which is a normal molecule found in the brain that's involved in lipid and cholesterol transport. You inherit one gene from each parent. So for apolipoprotein E, there are 3 different alleles or variants of that gene that you could inherit. So inheriting E4 alleles for apolipoprotein E increases your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, or at least certain forms of Alzheimer's disease, and so is a very critical one. It's obvious that this is one of the factors that you don't have control over, and so it might be important. There are companies that will look at your allele and determine whether or not you have the E4 alleles for apolipoprotein E, but you can't really alter it. You can't change it. So in general, most physicians do not recommend that people do that. Another risk factor which is associated with an increased risk for Alzheimer's is head injury. And this is either at a concussion or more severe level. So any time that a head injury has significantly interfered with neuronal activity at either a concussion or more severe level. We actually discovered this because it turns out that professional boxers who can take more than or sustain more than 50,000 hits to the head in their professional careers have a significantly increased incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And so we actually were looking at these boxers, and now there are scientists who are looking at individuals who play various sports in which head injury is common, looking and following to see whether or not these individuals are more likely. And at this point, the consensus is yes. So you want to protect your head. This is really, really important. Another risk factor is a high-fat diet, elevated cholesterol levels, and obesity. Boy, now this is under our control. So having this as a finding is very significant because this is something that we can make lifestyle changes so that it decreases our risk. So high-fat diets, elevated cholesterol, and obesity, which are rampant in our society, increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. There are also a number of chronic disorders that increase the risk. Atherosclerosis, for example, diabetes, hypertension. These are chronic disorders. Now, some individuals have genetic proclivities to have these disorders, and there may not be a lot they can do about that. You can take meds, but for other people, it's due to lifestyle. So changes can be made. For example, type 2 diabetes. If it's because of obesity, that's something an individual has some control over, and so they can get rid of the diabetes and also decrease their risk for Alzheimer's disease. Another factor which has been shown to increase the risk is smoking. And not only does it cause lung cancer and many other chronic disorders like emphysema, it actually is a risk factor in developing Alzheimer's disease. So if there wasn't enough of a motivation to quit this habit, smokers, by the way, I want to stop here a bit to remind you of this. Anything that is an addicting drug involves the nucleus accumbens septi and involves dopamine release. Nicotine is among one of the most highly addictive drugs known. So individuals who are addicted to nicotine really need a lot of support in breaking the habit because the nucleus accumbens is involved, and it's part of that endogenous reward system. And when they stop smoking, the brain has this craving for wanting to return to the state and stimulating particular receptors and increasing dopamine transport in the system. So it's not just so easy to just say quit smoking. Individuals really do need a lot of help, and now you know why they do, because nicotine affects that nucleus accumbens. Another risk factor that increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease is a history of clinical depression. So individuals who are chronically depressed or have a history of having true unipolar depression actually have an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. Another risk factor, which is one that has been discovered, is a diagnosis of what is called mild cognitive impairment. And this used to be thought of an entity in itself. So mild cognitive impairment is defined as a disorder that involves short-term memory loss but no other cognitive deficits. So we thought that it was really a disease that probably just involved the hippocampus, for example. Well, we now believe that it's more than likely the earliest stage of Alzheimer's. Studies, long-term studies have shown that 80% to 100% of individuals diagnosed with MCI will in fact go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So most experts now believe those individuals have just been diagnosed at an early stage that doesn't normally occur. Now, hormone replacement therapy. Individuals, women who are greater than 65 years of age, who start either taking estrogen alone or estrogen and progesterone, have an increased risk of dementia and of developing Alzheimer's disease. So there's still studies going on about what happens if the woman is younger when she starts the regimen. All this is an active area of research for obvious reasons. I want you right now to stop for a minute and note that the majority of risk factors that increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease are exactly the same risk factors that increase your risk for heart disease and increase your risk for stroke and heart attack. And so this is, really, really important discovery. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that discovery was made. The point is that many of the factors that increase your risk for stroke and heart attack and heart disease are under your control. And we now know that it's the same risk factors involved in both of these terrible, terrible diseases. Well, now that was the bad news. So what factors actually decrease the risk of Alzheimer's? Let's end on a sort of positive note here. Well, one of the factors that decreases your risk is one you have no control over. Inheritance of E2 alleles for apolipoprotein E actually protects you from ever getting Alzheimer's disease. This is a very active area of research for obvious reasons. Another factor that decreases your risk is eating omega-3 fats. Now, these are cold water fish like salmon. This actually decreases the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. The word is still out on whether or not taking supplements has the same effect. It isn't always true that the body can be fooled by supplements. And so at this point, eating them through eating certain kinds of fish is recommended. Maintaining a normal weight, avoiding obesity, and its associated disorders like diabetes. So these are things that are under our control and that we can do something about. And it's very, very important. Eat low-fat foods. Keep your low-density lipoproteins low. Do all the things that are recommended to help you with heart disease, and this will help you stave off Alzheimer's disease. Drinking fruit juices, vegetable juices, eating fruits and vegetables and certain kinds of teas that are high in antioxidants is definitely implicated in decreasing the risk of developing Alzheimer's. And again, these are simple changes we can make in our lives that it may not prevent us from getting the disease, but it certainly plays a role. So it's very, very important. Now, the next one is one of my favorites, exercise. I want to tell you something, some of the cutting edge research that's going on in neuroscience right now. Recent studies have shown that the hippocampus is one of the few areas of the brain that continues to undergo mitosis throughout life. Furthermore, the most recent studies have shown that exercise increases mitosis in the hippocampus. So by staying physically active, you actually generate more new neurons in the structure that's involved in memory in your brain. And so this is just unbelievably important. Now, it's not going to replace your old memories to generate new neurons, but it will allow you to form new memories. And so this is a very, very positive thing. We need to keep ourselves active. We become so sedentary. We need to keep ourselves active. And this is going to help us, even if we don't develop a disorder like Alzheimer's, it's going to help us maintain our memory and mental activity into old age. One of the other factors that's been shown to be important is going to be continuing mental challenge. So we find that in individuals who continually challenge their minds, and it has to be something that challenges you, like taking a course like this, learning a new language, learning how to play the piano, doing something like that. It has to involve a challenge to the brain, that this actually is a major way of decreasing the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, many of these risk factors were actually discovered in this NUN study. And this is was just a wonderful little study. This study has gone on for more than 20 years now. And it was observed that there were women, nuns, who lived in convents, certain convents, who seemed to have a very low incidence of Alzheimer's disease and very little evidence of cognitive decline. Some of these women were 104 years old learning foreign language. They sit around and they debate political questions. They're very active mentally. They had a lifestyle which was incredible. We'll come back to that in a minute. But in order to understand their longevity and their decreased incidence of Alzheimer's disease, scientists approached these women and they agreed to help benefit science by donating their brains to the National Institutes of Health so that their brains could be studied after they died. And some of the most important findings that have emerged in our understanding of risk factors have actually come from the NUN study. One of the most important is that the only nuns that showed evidence of Alzheimer's disease also showed in their brains microinfarctions, which means the only women who demonstrated Alzheimer's disease were also women who'd had small strokes in their brains. And we now know that these two diseases are comorbid, which means they occur together. So atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's disease occur together in a comorbid way. So this was one of the main things that came from this. A woman could have died at 106, and when you examine her brain, she showed none of these massive changes seen in dementia. 106 and mentally sharp, able to carry on an intelligent conversation, learn foreign languages, do these things. The ones who developed Alzheimer's showed evidence of these microinfarctions. This is really important, too, on a scientific level, because we can actually induce the formation of neurofibrillary tangles and plaques in the brains of animals by causing their brains to be ischemic. So while animals don't normally get Alzheimer's disease, we can actually induce the same changes in their brain by cutting parts of their brain off from oxygen. And so this is one of the animal models that's used to study this disease. Note again, the risk factors for developing this disease overlap with the risk factors for heart disease. And it's no wonder in America, where we have obesity, diabetes, high cholesterol levels, poor eating habits, sedentary habits, that both of these disorders are on the rise. Now, another interesting finding that emerged from this nun study, which I think is like really cool, is that they actually did a blind study looking at the journals that these sisters kept throughout their careers. And so when they enter the convent, say when they're in their 20s, they kept these journals. Well, they had individuals who didn't know which of the sisters had developed Alzheimer's and which of the sisters had not developed it. And these individuals rated the complexity of ideas and the emotional content of the writings. Well, it turns out that the only individuals who later developed Alzheimer's already showed changes early on with the lack of ability to use language in a complex way. They showed a paucity of ideas in their writings, and also their writings had less emotional content in them than the sisters who never developed Alzheimer's disease. And scientists are still thinking about what this means, but it could be that this disease, in its incipient sort of forms, begins early. And then if you have poor lifestyle habits or you have some kind of genetic tendency towards cholesterol accumulation in the brain, you have some other kind of thing like that, that the disease then manifests itself many years later. One of the other things that came from this study is very important. It focused on normal aging. There have been a lot of reports in the scientific literature. You know, is cognitive decline a normal aspect of aging? And we're not just talking about little changes, but major cognitive decline. Is this something we can all just expect is going to happen to us? More recent studies that have been done very, very carefully, and the nun study, indicate that that's not so. That normal aging does not have to be associated with major cognitive decline. No, you're not going to be 20 years old again, but it doesn't have to be associated with major cognitive decline. But this is related largely to lifestyle. And so they went back and they looked at the nuns in these convents. Many, many women, hundreds of brains of women who have died have been examined. And I'll recommend to you at the end of this a delightful book on the nun study, which is just really fun to read. They went back and looked at the lifestyle. So let's think about the lifestyle of a nun. You live a relatively protected life that has relatively low stress. You have many friends that you share similar viewpoints and ideas with, that you interact with every day. It turned out that these women had incredibly good eating habits, very low fat diet, ate a lot of fruits and vegetables, you know, the fruit of the earth and all that. And it also turned out that they do yoga every day and do aerobic exercise multiple times a week. These women had a lifestyle that contributed to being mentally healthy. And again, some of these women, and in this book that's about this study, some of these women are 104 years old, and the scientist who is doing this study always makes this comment about how he couldn't believe how bright these women were. And he could sit for hours and talk with them about politics, about what was going on, what the meaning of life was. They were reading philosophy books. They were well read. And he said the time would just fly by. And he would sit with these women and he would talk with them. Someone 104 years old or 106 years old. And then they would die simply in their sleep. But their brains would look like a brain of a person much younger. Now, this is pretty heavy stuff, but there's a message here. And that message is that many things are, in fact, under our control. Some are not. We can't control what alleles for ApoE we inherited from mom and dad. But some things really are under our control. Now, to lighten things up here a little bit, I thought what I might do is to share with you, because it turns out that my pets have given me some wise little things over the years, a wisdom that goes right along with what we've been talking here about how to decrease the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. So I thought I would just share a few stupid pet pictures with you, but the take-home message will be to live a good life and take care of yourself. So the first is, it's very important to take time to smell the roses. Now, this is my deck that overlooks where the sun sets. Here are roses that are on this deck. Here's little buttercup. It's important if you're going to smell the roses that your nose be pointed in the right direction. You'll notice that her buddy, who is little apple blossom, has her nose pointed off in the wrong direction, which is sad. So take time to smell the roses and make sure your nose is pointed in the right direction. Get lots of really restful sleep. It's very important to enjoy sleep and get lots of good, restful, energizing sleep. Get lots of exercise. Take up a new sport. This is Heine's stud muffin, and Heine, of course, took up football, that's clear, and he loved that football. But get out there and do something, move. Take up dancing. Take an aerobics class. Go for walks with your friends. Get out of the chair and go do something. Keep your mind and body active by learning new things. This is little Apple Blossom, and she's learned how to sit up. And she's very proud of this, and she walks around and then suddenly just sits up for no reason at all. She seems to think that something good always occurs from that. It doesn't necessarily. But go ahead and learn new tricks. Don't keep yourself from learning new tricks in life. I think this is really important. Take courses from the teaching company. Keep your mind active. Learn new things. Learn another foreign language. Take piano lessons. Take violin lessons. Does it really matter that you don't become concert level? No, it doesn't. So learn new tricks throughout your life. Keep friendships strong. These are the Bell sisters. This is Floshilda, named after a Rhine maiden in a Wagner opera, and little Schatzi, which means my little treasure, my little darling. And it's Floshilda and Schatzi Ringenklanger. So they're the Bell sisters of Tennessee. Keep your friendships really strong. And don't be afraid to make new friends in your life, because new friends add something really special. And even if they're very different from you, don't be afraid to make new friends. Keep stress at a minimum. This epitomizes the peace that this beautiful cat Dickie had most of his life. And so keep stress as much as you're able to at a minimum. Stress kills neurons in the brain, and we're going to be talking about that. It's important to practice habits that keep stress as much as possible under some kind of control. Don't eat too much. Now, eat a low-fat diet. You can have pancakes every once in a while, but make sure they're made with low-fat ingredients. This is my rescue bird, Pumpernickel, and she used to always try to eat my pancakes. So on Sunday morning, I would make her own little stack. And that goes to a really important thing, and that is eat small portions. Keep your weight under control, eat a low-fat diet, but enjoy what you eat. Keep oxytocin flowing, our little lovebirds, Heine and Buttercup. Keep love strong in your life. We know that this enhances the immune system, and this enhances the ability of the brain to function. Now, lastly, every once in a while, just do something really stupid. This was my very first dog, Frankie, who every Christmas had to wear that little Santa Claus hat. Don't be afraid to let others laugh at you, and by all means, laugh at yourself. Laughter, it turns out, is one of the most valuable things for the brain and valuable things for having a really good life. So to end this, I want to say, and in all seriousness, there are changes we can make in our life. Life was meant to be lived every day. Live it with passion. Live it with joy, and appreciate each moment of it, and appreciate your brain and take care of it. If you are interested in reading more about the nun study, there's a delightful book called Aging with Grace. And David Snowden was the scientist who studied these women, and he has written this book, and I highly recommend it. And it's a book that adds to our feeling about life being something that should be enjoyed and appreciated, because these women, that is the message that this book and these nuns will communicate to you. Thank you.